questions. I'm like, yeah.
Okay. So the Module 7 webinar is about disability, ableism, and gifted racial segregation in schools. The first question is, what are factors associated with why students of color are disproportionately identified for special education?
I'll start. One of the notes that I had down, one of the reasons, just through my reading, I came up with was that schools and teachers lack an understanding of why students are experiencing difficulties in school. These reasons may include general school curriculum not addressing the needs of students from diverse backgrounds, so the curriculum, stressful home environments, or inadequate or biased general education curriculum, and poor prior instruction and research. So all back to the bias, unable to get a good evaluation.
Yes, and I spoke. I believe it was the article titled "Overrepresentation of Minority Students in Special Education: A Continuing Debate." Also going back to students of color, it mentioned how it's been reported, for instance, that there's a disproportionate number of Latino students are labeled as having a learning disability due to their limited English proficiency. So just simply because they, come in maybe not speaking English as their first language, and it may take them a while to accumulate that, they can just automatically be considered as having a learning disability, and it's simply just because of language acquisition.
It goes like one thing that I thought about when I read this question is it goes Sweet Home Alabama, the movie. It made me think of the line where he says, "Just because I talk slow doesn't mean I am slow." Yeah, so that was one of the things that I picked up on this was like, these kids may not speak English or English as their first language, and that's the reason that they're over classified as special ed. But just because they don't speak English doesn't mean that they're special ed, right?
Mm-hmm.
They could just have a hard time picking up on the language.
Mm-hmm. So in knowing this, what federal policies have shaped the educational experiences of students with disabilities in terms of justice and the law?
I should remember learning about a lot of these I just took one course in college, so just focused on special education. So we broke down each of these by a week and focused on them, which was really interesting because I think a lot of times teachers need more emphasis on these programs, and of course with it being a federal policy. So just examples, the IDEA, FAPE, as we would call it, those are all acronyms. But the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, make sure I have that right.
That's right.
And it's kind of the same thing with, going along with a lot of the other ones, like least restrictive environment, zero reject. They just kind of go as along saying that no matter what the type of child, their ability versus disability or learning skill, that they should be provided a free and appropriate education, and that the schools should make accommodations or do what they need to in order to provide that for them.
And for that question, I noted that when it talks about how it shaped the educational experiences, it says that the IDEA in the forward text has said that it's a label that signals or can signal substandard performance, and while that label is intended to bring additional supports, it may also bring lowered expectations on the part of teachers, other children, and the identified student.
Yeah, that's definitely an unintended consequence, but yeah, I think it's a legitimate.
Yep.
Agreed.
All right, so this next question is kind of going to break our flow, I feel like, but it says, what are the different special education categories that educators should be aware of, and what are the differences between them? We're going to pick what you were saying up again, though, Shelby, because I feel like we could talk a lot about that.
Okay, so in terms of when I think about the way these questions link together, I think about how if I were to say a student needed support, but they were like had a deficit in one subject area versus the other, their supports change or their eligibility at all changes, which I think relates to how we can struggle to get kids the services they need because sometimes they don't even qualify, was where I went with this question. the categories in which a kid would qualify for something or not.
Mm-hmm.
I know at our school, even like RTI, like response to intervention, was a huge push, and especially like the Title I schools, to try to avoid kids getting those like negative labels when really they just need extra support. And maybe it's not even in all subject areas, maybe it's just specifically in math or in reading.
Right.
Well, and I think, you know, the key is not to, you know, I think that we get so hung up on the diagnosis that we forget to address the issue of how it impacts their access to their education, because sometimes it doesn't. And so we end up, you know, identifying and providing services and creating that chain of events unnecessarily. And then, just like you said, a lot of times they do need that extra support, but by the criteria established for each of these categories, and these are always changing. The last ideation of IDA took out a lot of the behavior stuff, you know, so that a lot of those kids don't qualify anymore for services. But and then the other thing I thought that was interesting in just talking about categories is how the over-identification actually also not just happens for just over-identification for services, but like there's some bias in what we're diagnosing them as. And instead of like a white kid would be more likely to be diagnosed with autism, where a student of color might be more likely to have a behavior disorder or emotional disability. And so, and then the stigma that goes along with those different kind of, so there's even like some kind of like, I don't know, like an acceptance of like autism as being a better or more preferable diagnosis than, you know, emotional disability. That was interesting.
Yeah. Like I found a statistic that said African American students make up 32% of students classified with mental retardation and 28.7% of students with severe emotional disturbance. And like those numbers are just drastically higher than every other subgroup.
Absolutely.
And for the number of there are the race, I mean, I don't think it's like for sure for public education. Like I'm thinking like, you know, population in general, but I guess it's different for public education, the amount of students of color versus white, what the percentages are there. So
yeah, it should be consistent.
And sorry, my last thing I was going to add for that is when it says what are the different special education categories that educators should be aware of. When it says special education categories, do you think that's also in the one article, like where it lists all the disability categories, like everything from, like I said, like autism, emotional disturbance, multiple disabilities, developmental delay, hearing impairments, orthopedic impairments. So like when I was reading them at the bottom, like hearing impairments, orthopedic impairments, visual impairments, traumatic brain injury, deaf, blindness. When I was reading all those, I was like, honestly, when I think special ed at school, like at least in the school, the schools we're in, I think sometimes they have those separated. Like they have the schools for like the deaf and the blind, or sometimes they'll have the schools for like severe physical impairments versus if it ties in with your learning too. So you get a physical disability but have a perfectly fine mind. So when I was reading the article, those other categories, I had forgotten about them until I read like, oh, I guess this would be special education categories, even if someone's just born, you know, deaf or blind.
Yeah, and you don't, just because you're in a wheelchair, just because you're blind doesn't mean you need special education services. You might just need some accommodations through the American Disabilities Act, you know, something like that. But I think, a lot of times people just assume that they must be getting services if they're in a wheelchair or, but no, we have to qualify kids under one of these. And multiple disabilities usually is where ADHD comes in. And that's a real big one these days that wasn't really addressed specifically back when it's moving from a low incident to a high incident. And, and not just deciding that they have those characteristics, but also are these things getting in the way of their learning?
Mm-hmm. So in thinking of that, like what role do we as educators play in how students are identified for special education and the services that they may or may not receive?
So I had it down that the teachers, I mean, it's huge. Not only are you putting the RTI interventions in place, you know, making sure that they have access to a quality education, because we also have to decide that when we're diagnosing, is that if they haven't had access to a systematic, high quality education, we can't qualify them, because that's an environmental problem, not a disability. So we have to establish that first. So teachers have to put those things in place, do the the higher level interventions, then they have to do the referral, and then the special ed teachers jump in, do the evaluations, and kind of make the decision about eligibility based on that, and then create the program. So I mean, from beginning to end, it's mostly teachers with some help from psychs.
Yep.
I think what concerns me is like we think like the identification is the beginning to the end, but then to me the most important part is actually the implementation of the services that the kids need. And I know a lot of teachers that aren't familiar with the accommodations that a student needs, and they're not providing them. So I think that's another role that educators play, and maybe not always positively.
In my reading that came up, that they are over-identified, but then they're also underserved after they're identified. So they're the kids of color are not getting. There's some statistics that they're actually not getting the least restrictive environment as consistently as white students. So essentially, we're resegregating these kids, because we're pulling them out more often than we're likely to with white kids.
And that's exactly like the next question. What should educators know about the experiences of students of color who are misidentified for special education? I think Lily touched on that at the beginning with like the students that are still learning English or whatnot.
Yeah, and I can even say it's just like so funny when I read that, because I've taught in 3 different schools, 3 different districts, very different populations. I feel like I just had this like smorgasbord of comparison. But I automatically, right off the bat, I had students that said color of, just all over the world. And I just automatically found them, even despite the language barrier, as the smartest students. And so I just don't know, like when I'm reading this, I'm like, people of color, I was like, our special education classes are like majority like white kids, or maybe biracial, and maybe black. Okay, they are students of color. But when I'm thinking Hispanics or Middle Eastern students or Indian or African, like they were sometimes my smartest students, and so I have to like put that experience aside and think back to, okay, this is worldwide, I mean nationwide, but I'm sure it is systemic in some places to be that way. But in terms of what we're asking, what factors impact the under identification, is that we're on, or no, sorry, about experience of students of color who are misidentified. I think it kind of just comes to, the teachers. I think from my experience too, like they're who do the referrals. At least that's what I've experienced. And I mean, because no one else, unless it's like a previous teacher who's also had a student. But it's just like, I think if a teacher's going to make a referral to say this student could be special education, he or she needs services, like they just have to have so much evidence to back it up. I mean, it can't just be like, oh, he came in barely knowing English and he's barely catching on, barely getting through. He's been here 6 months. Like, he must be special ed. Like, I've never viewed it that way. So I just think that there's educators who are going to, especially, advocate for students of color to not be misidentified. They just have to have such documentation and representation to be like, okay, this is why I think they are, or this is why they're not.
I also think it comes back to like you're kind of saying, like the culturally relevant pedagogy. Like it's not fair to recommend a student for special education if your instruction to begin with isn't relevant to their learning needs to begin with.
Preach. You're exactly right.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have anything to say about that one? Okay. What factors impact the under-identification of students of color for gifted education?
Let's see, I had some quotes. So the book, the article, the readings kind of talked about it from the teacher's perspective and the parent's perspective. Parents from low-income and non-white backgrounds are less likely to advocate for their children. which impacts the identification of gifted students.
Mm-hmm.
So not having that advocacy at home, and then kind of that lack of sometimes of early childhood when a lot of that stuff is identified, having that lack of early childhood education available. And then what it really boiled it down to was implicit bias. And this quote was, why are white teachers less likely to refer black students? And so we know we have a ton more white teachers than black teachers. And white teachers are less likely to refer them based on research. It's implicit bias, nearly unconscious split-second judgments that humans make given 85% of the current national workforce is white. Their views and biases are impactful. Sometimes these biases go deeper, causing teachers to underestimate a student's academic ability and intellectual, not only based on their race and income, but something as arbitrary as their name.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Definitely a common theme running through all of these things we've been talking about. A bias toward.
I also have from one of the probably the article that was talking about underrepresentation of students of color. I just say one of the quotes was like, while teacher under referral is a significant contributing factor, problematic also is testing and assessment, which is often administered by school psychologists. So teacher referral, again, I'm just going back to my experiences. My past school, there was no teacher referral. I think that by a certain, they were termed as gifted in second grade. Based off this one test that our gifted teacher came in and prepared the students for like the first few weeks of school, and they went over types of practice problems, and then they took this test and they passed. They got a certain score. They were gifted. If they didn't, they weren't. So like literally, teacher referral had nothing to do with it at my past school. But then I think maybe if they like all of a sudden just outshine students in like third or fourth grade, they could retake some tests and be put in. So maybe that's where teacher referral would come into. But even myself, when I was growing up in South Carolina, I was in, we called it Aegis, whatever that stood for gifted, third, fourth, fifth grade. And we took a test in second grade as well. So I'm kind of wondering, again, these students could be gifted, but not be the best test takers. And then you're automatically like, oh, they're students of color. So, test taking may not be for them or something like that. So I think it definitely can come down to bias. But if the two factors are this assessment or maybe teacher referral, like it's just so easily to be overlooked if you just don't, blow those tests out of the water or something like that.
Yes, I agree, because I was a little thrown by these two questions because our students take a test in first and fifth grade. So I was like, I really don't know how to approach this. It's kind of just, we do it 2 days out of the year, and then you're either in gate or you're not. They're changing it, it seems.
I don't know.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, Justin, like, you teach high school. Like, do you ever find that there's, like, I guess I taught like a majority of black students, so I don't have like a good frame of reference. But like some of my students that were like the behavior problems were like put in my class, but they were sometimes like just ridiculously gifted. Like I had this one child who was like a photographic memory, like never listened to me at all, or so I thought, right? And then one day he just like quotes back the notes to me in math, and I'm just like, there's no way that anybody else in the entire class who knows what those page of notes say. Like, clearly you just have a photographic memory. And he's like, yeah, but don't tell anybody. And I was like, oh my gosh. So, like, I don't know, like, do you find that there's kids in your class that have just definitely been maybe overlooked because they were considered, like, behavior problems, and then maybe they were, like, I don't know, put in gifted, like, spots?
Yeah, so there's been students in my class. So right now I'm in a unique situation because I'm teaching seniors, but that's pre-algebra 2, so they have to have this credit. So these are the students that have failed math like a couple times, and they have to have this last credit to pass and graduate. But what I noticed is I have 2 girls in the class that are very social, but they understand the math. So it's so like I've talked to the teachers that taught them before, and they're like, oh yeah, all they do is talk, they won't listen, and this impacts their grade. Well, if you give them math problems and you sit them separate from each other, they absolutely can do the math. But since the teachers previous, maybe was just like, oh, they're talking, they're being disrespectful, I'm not going to pay too much attention to them. Like, that's why that could be contributed to why they had failed. I separated them from the get-go. Actually, I got very, very lucky because I set them in an alphabetical order, and they separated them on the opposite corners of the room. And I've given them some math problems and stuff, and I'm like, wow, these two girls can actually really, like, they know the math and stuff. It's just they're social butterflies, and so that's like part of the behavior issue, yeah, like social interaction. Maybe they talk too much and they weren't just mature enough as freshmen, sophomore, junior, and now that they're seniors, they're finally getting it.
Mm-hmm.
It's same but different story. I've got a kid on my caseload with autism. Sitting in a class, a lecture-based class, is just absolutely painful for this kid. And I've got a math teacher who gives him grades based on engagement and eye contact during class, during his keeping up with his notebook, his executive functioning is terrible. The kid isn't a disruption. He gets the highest score on the final, a perfect score, and he failed the class because she didn't base it on competency. She based it on fairness. That it's no fair that all the other kids did all the work and followed her expectations for classroom engagement, and he didn't. And so we had to write it into his program to basically override her and say that, you know, what his grading criteria would be. But yeah, it's a struggle.
That's like teaching 101, though, the difference between equality and equity. You know, like.
She's old school. She retired this year. Make my life much easier.
Hey, that's very interesting.
They probably cut her a deal and said, hey, get out of here, or else we're going to have to.
Amazing how long those people flounder.
Mm-hmm. Anything else that educators can do for the under-identification for students of color? I think we kind of talked about it.
So here's the question for you guys. I know some of you teach lower grades, like elementary and stuff, but do any of you guys teach high school? Because what are your guys' experience with thinking somebody needs services or thinking somebody is gifted, but not being able to, like you said, first and fifth grade kind of determines it. So underserving those students. And that was kind of what Alicia was talking about, yeah, but like what specific experiences have you guys had and how did you deal with those?
Sometimes what happens is everyone wants to qualify them, and we don't. And so it's almost like the exact opposite. It's like I find myself advocating more on the side of, do we really need to slap a label on this kid, or can we support this kid in the context of our core programs with a 504 or some accommodations? Do we really need to put a disability label on it? Because everyone seems teachers really like labels on kids, because the gen ed teachers love to have a partner and a special ed teacher, a reason to blame it on that's not, because it couldn't possibly be their teaching. And so they just get so worked up to let's give this kid a label and let's give them a diagnosis and get them all this extra help, and rather than trying to work through the tiers of intervention and things like that. So I as a special ed teacher, I often have to be the devil's advocate for making sure that we really need
I find myself doing the same thing. I had a girl last year that hardly came to school because she had anxieties and depression. And but the thing is that I built like a good relationship with her at the beginning of the year. So I was the only class, like I went to meetings for her. I was the only class that she came to campus for. And I was like, one thing that I was trying to tell administration and stuff, I was like, listen, if we give her the time of day to talk with her and to make sure she communicates with the teacher of who she wants to sit by and who she doesn't want to sit by and stuff, I was like, we don't have to sit like and have this create a 504 and make this kid feel like they're like a special education student and this and that. Like, she's dealing with stuff like her brother just went away from college. It was her only brother, and this is Maui, and nobody leaves this island, you know. And she's very depressed right now because brother left. I was like, but if we can just, like, it's sad because we don't have teachers, or I can't say we don't have teachers, but there's a lack in the teaching department of building these interpersonal relationships and showing students you care. Like, it's very cutthroat sometimes over here. Teachers think that they can just stand up. This is what's going to happen, and there's not a lot of pedagogy that goes into like building these relationships with students. And I think that this girl actually is suffering from it because she doesn't feel like a teacher cares that her brother just moved away. Whereas I was like, oh, you know, blank. I really understand. You know, I just moved all the way over here, yada yada yada. And she like, we built that relationship, and then she told in the very first meeting we sat down, it was her parents and her parents, you know, everybody that's supposed to be in that type of meeting, and she said, I only want to come to Mr. Allen's class. I will come to school when I have Mr. Allen in the morning. And I'm like, you know, that just made me feel really good, but it also made me realize like she just wants to feel like welcome. She doesn't want to feel like she's just another body in the room. And I think all students need to feel that.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you how many times I have teachers like, I have no problems with this kid. I don't know why everybody else, you know, and having those conversations as a team, especially with multiple teachers in a high school, sometimes it doesn't happen. So.
And I think it takes a teacher to like kind of take their ego out of it, because I've definitely said, you know what, like this, my class is just a little bit too structured for this student. Like they're gonna do better, and I know so and so's class, and we'll just do a swap. Like this girl does not do well with male figures. She needs to be with a female teacher, and just making those swaps, like taking your ego out of it and being like, this is what's best for this child. Like, make it happen, you know. And if you have an administration that supports that, that's even better.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, are we good?
Yeah.
Down with the first one.